If you were here last night, you saw that I do rely heavily on my PowerPoints to try to explain some of these science-related matters, so be sure that you're sitting in a place where you can see what's going on the screen if possible. Every projector is a little bit different, I find. I design these for my own projector, and sometimes even the colors aren't what I'd like them to be. Whenever I go to another projector, it'll change the colors a little bit. Hopefully you'll be able to see everything that I am putting on these slides as an aid in helping you to understand some of the things I'll be discussing in these sessions tonight. In our first session last night, we looked at the question of naturalism, evolution, which is the dominant standard model that is taught in our school system, and that is the idea that everything must be explainable through some natural way. When you look at biology and geology and cosmology in particular, you got to explain everything in a purely natural way without anything supernatural. And so we briefly looked at that subject last night, dismantled that idea. In this session and the session tomorrow morning during the Bible class hour, I want to do more of the flip side of the coin, and that is to give you some of the positive evidence for supernaturalism, for the existence of God. Many famous scientists today claim that religion and science are in fact at odds with each other. They can't both be true. They're enemies. Popular skeptic Michael Shermer, who has a monthly column in Scientific American, he said, for example, "It is a logical absurdity to try to squeeze the round peg of science into the square hole of religion." And it's not just skeptics that argue that. Some Christians even think that science and religion are in fact incompatible and cannot be harmonized with one another. But in actuality, it's clear from Scripture that God himself actually instituted the field of science. We don't often think about it that way, but he actually commanded and encouraged scientific exploration. You think back to the Garden of Eden. After he had created Adam and Eve, he told them to subdue the earth, to have dominion over it. Genesis 1:28, that's essentially the goal of science. We look in Psalm 111, verse 2, "The works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them." Is that not an encouragement of science, to study nature, to appreciate the great works of God? Romans 1:20, we find you can learn about the existence of God and even some of his attributes by studying the things that are made, studying his creation. That's science. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, we're told to test all things, hold fast what is good. That's essentially an 8-word summary of the scientific method. And so, did the global flood happen? Did evolution happen? Is the universe as young as the Bible indicates? Test all things, hold fast what is good. True science and the Bible are not going to be at odds. God himself actually instituted the field of science. That Romans 1:20 passage is especially a fascinating verse for scientists, one that is worthy of thought whenever you try to look at the world and recognize what Paul is telling us here. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Okay, so talking about the created order. And that is particularly of interest to me as a scientist. So in studying the created order over the centuries, humans have reasoned through and articulated many excellent philosophical arguments that point to the conclusion that there has to be a God outside of the nature box. And so these are arguments that have stood the test of time and continue to stand today, even though many of them have been around for centuries. Blair Scott of American Atheists, whenever he debated Kyle Budd a few years ago, he said, concerning these classical arguments, he said the theological arguments have not changed much over thousands of years. And he intended that to be a scoff, a jab at theists. The classical arguments haven't had to change over the centuries, though. That is true. And it's actually a compliment, because truth shouldn't have to change if it is the truth, other than gathering more and more evidence to substantiate that already established truth. Well, the famous British cosmologist and evolutionist Fred Hoyle, who actually coined the term Big Bang. He's actually the guy that came up with the term. He said, you should be suspicious of a theory if more and more hypotheses are needed to support it. Now, I find that truly ironic because it perfectly describes evolutionary theories. If you stay up with the scientific literature at all, something that characterizes all of the scientific literature is constant change when we're talking about evolutionary theories. They're always having to adjust it and change it and find out, well, we're wrong about that, so we think it's this now. And then they find out next, no, that's wrong, we think it's this. There's a constant change if you're talking about the Big Bang or you're talking about Darwinian evolution. But the classical arguments for the existence of God haven't changed. They haven't needed to. They've stood the test of time. They stand as testaments against atheism. The teleological argument in particular is an argument that is of special interest to the scientist. And this argument says that, hey, if you've got design, there's got to be a designer. This atheistic philosopher and professor, Paul Ricci, he essentially said that. It's true that everything designed has a designer. And that summarizes what we call the teleological argument. If you find the characteristic of design in the universe, there had to be, by implication, a designer. And atheists, like Ricci himself, generally admit that basic truth, but they generally refuse to admit the actual existence of design in the universe. But they do concede that if you could find design, that would indicate there has to be a designer. Because you can't have a poem without a poet. You can't have a painting and there not be a painter. If you see a fingerprint, there must be a finger, right? This is logical. Well-known story is told of a creation scientist. Some say it was Sir Isaac Newton, others say it was Benjamin Franklin, or neither one of them, but as the story goes, the creation scientist makes this exquisite model of the solar system. The sun being represented as this large golden ball in the middle, and the motion of the planets with their elliptical orbits in the solar system, they're scaled to size, and this was captured with precision and intricacy, revolving around the sun in these orbits using this network of gears. And a colleague of the scientist, and an atheist, walks into the room where the scientist is sitting there reading a book. And the colleague walks over in amazement, and for several minutes he's just looking this model over, just examining it closely in wonder. And finally he says in astonishment, "What an exquisite thing, who made it?" Right? The creation scientist, of course, without even looking up from his book, says nobody, it just happened. It just happened. All right? His point was clear, wasn't it? If atheism were true, if there is no God, then that ridiculous answer should be perfectly logical and acceptable and rational. But common sense tells you it's not. The man rightly asked, who made it? Who made this exquisite model? That was the logical, common sense question. It wasn't, how did this happen? You know, what exploded in here to make this? How long did it take for this to evolve on its own? Okay, if he had asked questions like that, we'd immediately wonder if something's wrong with this gentleman. Either that, or we would know that he had been conditioned to think against what is obvious and what is common sense, what is reasonable and logical based on evidence. But whenever all bias and prejudice and preconceived notions are dropped, we know intuitively, instinctively whenever design is present. Why? Because we have an understanding that when we see something that has complexity and order, it shouts out intent, purpose, a mind behind it. It doesn't shout out random chance, accidental change, big explosions. No, that's not what we see. Typically in the first semester or so of engineering school, students are required to take an introductory course that helps them to understand what engineering is and what the differences are between the various engineering fields, your mechanical and electrical and chemical and civil and so forth. And so there's usually a section on engineering ethics, thankfully. And along with this intro, there's typically a lengthy discussion on the nature and process of design, because that is, after all, what engineers primarily do. It's design. And so in these introductory courses, engineering students learn to appreciate how complex the design process really is. An effective design does not just happen. It's not something that's just thrown together. It doesn't create itself. It's not the result of a sequence of random events. like evolutionary theories suggest, got us here. It's not the result of an explosion in a messy room. There's an immense amount of planning and study and thought and intent and purpose that goes into a good design. The presence of design implies the existence of a designer. And the Bible stance, of course, on origin certainly has no problem with that idea. Hebrews 3:4, which I quoted last night, every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. That's logical. A house requires a builder. And that line of reasoning is in harmony with the evidence, with science, and this is also in harmony with the Bible. True science is the Christian's friend. It's not the enemy. A painting requires an artist. A law requires a law writer, of course. But does the universe contain this characteristic of design? That's the question. If a person is unbiased, not only will he see this evidence of design, but the naturalistic community even unwittingly admits that there is. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Many atheists respond to the design demands a designer argument by saying, well, okay, sure, design demands a designer, I concede that, but I just don't see solid evidence of design. And one of the problems with that response is that there are certain behaviors, certain things that are that the scientific community is doing today that contradicts that stubborn statement. Atheists bear certain fruits that show that they recognize the presence of design in the universe, although those admissions are unconscious, no doubt. Most won't openly admit it, but as Jesus said, by their fruits you'll know them. When you study the behavior of many atheists in the scientific community, you can identify their internal conflict and self-contradiction over this issue. They unconsciously send the message to the world that there is decisive evidence of design in the universe. Now, one area of scientific study where scientists are unconsciously but forcefully admitting the presence of design in the universe is in the field of biomimetics or biomimicry, as well as the related field known as bio-inspired design. Biomimicry is an attempt to engineer something, so you're trying to design something using something in the natural world as your blueprint. So engineers are becoming more and more aware of the fact that the world around us is already, it's filled with these fully functional, superior designs in comparison to what the engineering community has been able to develop to date. The webpage for George Washington University's Center for Biomimetics and Bio-Inspired Engineering says this: however, despite our seeming prowess in these component technologies, we find it hard to outperform nature in this arena. Nature's solutions are smarter, more energy efficient, agile, adaptable, fault-tolerant, environmentally friendly, and multifunctional. Thus, there is much that we as engineers can learn from nature as we develop the next generation machines and technology. Now, that's an amazing concession about the magnificent design that is inherent in the universe, and yet these engineers would hardly be considered friendly to the creation movement. But this kind of mindset is becoming widespread in the engineering community. And so biomimicry is becoming a major engineering pursuit. You see this in the science magazines. There's always something in there about biomimicry going on. Now, the field of biomimicry is growing by leaps and bounds, with research centers being established all over the world, with their express purpose being to mimic the design of nature. But think about that. The whole field of biomimicry is actually a concession by the scientific community that nature exhibits design. Engineers are the designers of the scientific community. So when engineers engage in biomimicry, we are endorsing the concept that there is design in nature. It would be totally senseless to try to design something useful by mimicking something that's just an accident. It's just random and chaotic. And so for the highly educated, brilliant designers of the scientific community to copy nature proves that nature must be much more than a product of random chance and accidents. And so let's take a few moments and look at some of the more recent examples of how engineers are bowing to the superior design that is inherent in nature. The first area that I wanted to look at is in schools of fish. As fish swim, they create a vortice in their wake. There's a churning behind them as the water reacts to the fish movement. And amazingly, engineers are discovering that schools of fish actually take advantage of these vortices as they're swimming in order to reduce the amount of energy that they have to use to swim. So kind of like how race cars use drafting in a long race. So engineers from Caltech are now trying to take advantage of this feature, and they're designing vertical axis wind farms using the spatial arrangements of these schools of fish in order to try to improve their efficiency. So the instinctive way that fish are able to swim in such an effective way in their schools clearly shows brilliant design. Why else would designers want to try to mimic that ability? Another example, engineers are more and more coming to the realization that insects function extremely well, especially when you consider the fact that their brains carry less than 0.01% as many neurons as do human brains. And yet their ability to maneuver, especially in the air, is unequaled in engineering. We can't even mimic this. And one of the insect features that engineers have recently discovered is that many of them are equipped with a sophisticated engineering sensor that helps the insect keep track of its orientation and stay upright while it's flying. Ocelli are these small eyes that are located on the heads of various kinds of insects. So these are eyes that are in addition to those larger compound eyes that you can see more easily. Usually think of those as the insect's eyes. And the compound eyes are associated with insect vision. But many of these insects also have these ocelli in addition to their compound eyes. So engineers believe these ocelli are horizon sensors. They're dedicated to that purpose. They locate the horizon to help the insect keep track of its orientation while it's flying. Well, with these ocelli in mind, engineers are trying to mimic these horizon sensors in the design of aerial vehicles. Engineers from Caltech and Australian National University, in association with NASA, have designed a biomorphic ocellus, mimicking the ocelli of dragonflies in order to try to help achieve an improved flight stabilization system for their aerial vehicles. So again, when engineers engage in this kind of design, they're acknowledging the presence of design in the universe, whether or not they're meaning to. It makes no sense to say, well, evolution just caused these features to accidentally develop and be perfected over millions of years, but all of us guys that have studied this stuff can't do it, and so we got to go copy off of this. No, Darwinian evolution doesn't have the ability to design horizon sensors on the head of a dragonfly. Evolution does not have a mind, and yet these features show intent and purpose. They show a mind behind them. Another example, you ever put your hand out the window as you're driving down the interstate and you feel the effect of the wind hitting your hand? You ever done that? I did it more as a kid. And so you'd find, if you tilted your hand at different angles, you'd find the wind would hit it in a different way and it would do something different to your hand, right? You might have noticed that based on the angle of that tilt, it might throw it up into the air. In some places, it might push it back. It might drop it. It does different things. Now, this same principle is used in helicopter and wind turbine blades. And again, if you tilted your hand at the wrong angle, it would do funny things to your hand. And that's a kind of stalling. It's what we call stalling. And this can be a major problem for devices that use blades whenever they get into that range of the angle of those blades. So some scientists have realized that humpback whales don't seem to have this problem. They can tilt their fins at aggressive angles as they're swimming without this stalling problem happening and without creating too much drag. And so that allows them to change their depth quickly or their orientation so that they can catch prey that are much faster than they are. These are huge guys that can't move as quick as their smaller, faster prey. So engineers went to work trying to figure out what is allowing for this kind of maneuvering. And it's what they found, I think, is amazing. Notice in the fin of this whale that there are these bumps. There's funny little ridges called tubercles. And here's another picture. Scientists at a company known as Whale Power, located up in Toronto, Canada, they figured out that these tubercles have something to do with the maneuverability of these whales, although we still don't totally understand what is going on here. So the company published work in 2004 showing that blades or fins that are designed with bumps like these tubercles on humpback whale fins will push the stall angle on blades back by as much as 40%. And so the new blade design is reported by Popular Mechanics to increase the annual production of electrical power by wind farms by 20%. Okay, so can anyone honestly deny that the universe has superior design features? Engineers, again, we still don't even totally understand why these tubercles work in the way they do. So to claim that these just happened by accident without a purpose in mind is ludicrous. It's irrational. It's a blind faith to say that would happen, and it makes no sense to say that. It's simply ridiculous. Another example going on at Caltech, something they have been working on. The engineers out there are studying the mechanics of animal swimming and flying animals as well to try to design vehicles that will propel themselves in the ways that these creatures can, some various creatures. The engineers have realized that, again, animals are able to achieve an amazing degree of stealth, energy efficiency, and ability to maneuver that we just haven't been able to compete with whenever we try to design our own robots. And so the Caltech engineers are analyzing how jellyfish and squid are able to move in the way they do in order to try to design water vehicles that use this same kind of movement known as pulsed jet propulsion. They're finding that using this sort of movement actually reduces underwater vehicle energy consumption by up to 30%. All right, now again, that sound to you like the jellyfish was well designed enough to be mimicked by the engineering community. Another example, trees were designed to sway so that the force that is created by wind shearing, especially at the top of a tree, won't cause that tree to just be ripped up out of the ground and fall over. And so this swaying feature allows some of that wind force to be dissipated and spread out over the height of the tree. Well, you may have already known that skyscrapers today are designed mimicking that swaying feature. They actually sway a little bit. At the top, you can even feel it a little bit more. The amount of sway is a matter of design, but the swaying feature is critical, especially as skyscrapers are becoming taller and taller. But something you may not have been aware of is that engineers are also realizing more and more that the conventional classic shape of skyscrapers, that being a rectangular box-like shape, may be an effective use of space, but it's about the worst possible design when it comes to withstanding the head-on collision with wind forces that are hitting that, especially up higher. So engineers have studied various shapes to try to figure out how those shapes respond to intense airflow in wind tunnels, for example. So they've tried cylindrical shaped structures, which proved to be more effective in dealing with airflow than rectangles, and a line of skyscrapers have been developed with that principle. And it's certainly an improvement over the rectangular approach, but the constant diameter of a cylindrical shape from bottom to top still causes an accumulation of force along the height of this shape that is injected into the building. Now that might not be as big of a deal at lower heights, but again, as these buildings get taller, that accumulated force gets pretty substantial, especially in particularly windy areas of the world. So engineers are now realizing that a cone shape actually eliminates the problem of force accumulation, and skyscrapers are starting to be built more with that idea, more of a cone-like shape with a larger diameter at the bottom of the skyscraper. So after all of this scientific investigation, engineers are concluding that the best shape for extremely tall structures is a cone-like shape. And guess what? Have you ever noticed that trees tend to have a cone-like shape to them? So think about the design of tree trunks. They're not rectangular. That'd be a poor design. They're closer to cylindrical, which is better, but if they were a very stiff wood, then they're generally not going to be totally cylindrical. A telephone pole is cylindrical. You got a constant diameter from bottom to top. But trees tend to be wider at the bottom and narrower at the top, even if just slightly at times, but cone-like nonetheless. And that slight difference in diameter, especially for those taller trees that have a greater stiffness to them, helps to eliminate the accumulation of force along the height of that tree. So according to the latest in engineering knowledge, that is an excellent design for tall structures. And not only is the trunk in a cone-like shape, but notice that the leaf and branch portion of the tree also exhibit a cone-like shape. The length of the branches at the bottom of a tree tend to be longer than they are at the top, which creates this cone-like shape. So tree trunks, tree branches make this cylindrical shape for trees. Does that sound like good design? Well, again, it appears based on the latest research that engineers would have to say yes. And what else, of course, would we expect if we're talking about the chief engineer of the universe? And that's not all. Engineers are also beginning to be interested in mimicking the actual movable dynamic architecture of a tree. The city of Dubai is actually using tree design to develop a new line of architecture that they call dynamic towers. The center of the skyscrapers resemble a thick trunk that runs from the ground up with floors acting like branches and leaves that shadow the rhythm of nature, they say in their literature. Italian architect David Fisher said, quote, "Our buildings will follow the rhythms of nature that will change direction and shape from spring to summer, from sunrise to sunset, and adjust themselves to the weather. These buildings will be alive." So the floors in these buildings will actually be able to rotate and move independently like the independence of the branches of a tree. And the inhabitants of the buildings will actually be able to extend their balconies like little sprigs on a branch or like leaves in order to soak up the sun. So notice, this is a whole new level of biomimicry now. So engineers equipped with the latest in technological knowledge are turning to the trees to mimic their movement, their shape, and their architecture in the design of skyscrapers. And again, we have to ask ourselves, if nature doesn't exhibit design and intent and planning, why are so many engineers using it as a blueprint for the latest designs? If the world was not designed, this practice would make no sense. Another example, you've probably heard about the camera and its many similarities to the human eye. The Time Life Science Library Series volume on the body said, "The eye operates on the same principle as the camera, the only machine directly modeled on a sense organ." So the camera was a direct product of biomimicry. It was actually designed by studying the human eye. But what you might not have heard about is the latest engineering research, which is taking the camera a step further. Engineers are now trying to mimic the size and even the shape of the human eye, rather than just the inner workings of the eye, which are still an object of bewilderment to scientists. Scientists at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in Northwestern University, they've developed a camera that mimics the actual curves of the human retina. And so the camera shown on the screen here looks like the human eye in its shape. So what did engineers find if you design a camera that mimics the shape of the human eye? Well, the camera can take wide-angle pictures without distortion, just like the human eye can. So how could anyone honestly say that a thing like that could evolve by chance? This is clear evidence of design and purpose. There is intent in the design of the human eye. These are qualities which indicate the presence of a designer. There's a mind behind the product. So biomimicry, attempting to copy nature, it's a great idea, but in some applications, it's impossible. We just don't have the knowledge and the understanding to be able to even mimic some of the complexity we see in nature. And so some engineers are saying, well, let's just forget trying to copy it. It's too hard. Let's instead just see if we can control it and use it. Enter the discipline of bio-robot or animal cyborg development. These are animals that have been equipped with technology for the purpose of controlling them or guiding them to be used by humans. An insect neurobiologist, John Hildebrand of University of Arizona in Tucson, is involved in cyborg research. He said there's a long history of trying to develop micro-robots that could be sent out as autonomous devices, but I think many engineers have realized that they can't improve on Mother Nature. So instead of trying to mimic it, his research involves just trying to control it. And so, of course, his statement really is irrational. It doesn't make any sense to attribute Mother Nature with designing something, right? Because she doesn't have a mind. She doesn't have that capability. She's not even a she. But statements like that show that engineers have trouble looking at nature and not seeing evidence of a mind, of a designer behind it. One of the ways animals are being controlled today is by implanting electronics into animal bodies, like in the brain. And those electronics are then used to manipulate the movements and behaviors of creatures. Cyborg research and experimentation using brain electrodes has been going on since the 1950s, when Jose Delgado of Yale University implanted electrodes into the brains of bulls to stimulate the hypothalamus area of the brain for control purposes. You can actually go and see some videos of this on YouTube, where you'll see a bull charging him and he pushes a button and the bull stops mid-charge. And so since then, a list of remotely controlled animals using electrode implantation has grown, believe it or not, to include sharks, specifically spiny dogfish, rats. University of Florida in Gainesville is even using rats for locating humans during search and rescue missions, as well as using them for explosives detections. Monkeys are being controlled with electrode implantation as well. And as you'd expect, mice, as well as chimpanzees. Frogs have been implanted, as well as pigeons and cats and gibbons and macaques. And as creepy as it may sound, cockroaches. Imagine what good spies cockroaches would be, equipped with miniature cameras on them and getting into the White House, right? Cornell University, the University of California at Berkeley, University of Michigan, Arizona State University at Tempe are working on developing flying insect cyborgs, including hawk moths and green June beetles. So each one of these instances of cyborg development constitutes a stamp of endorsement by the engineering community that the earth and its tenants have the element of design. Today's engineers simply can't compete with the design of the created order. We're just trying to control it instead. Non-invasive remote creature control projects are underway as well. So this is where, instead of actually implanting something into the brain of a creature, the creature is controlled from the outside. So for example, at MIT, they're using virtual fencing with GPS to track and herd cows by using sound cues and shock reinforcement to keep cows within a certain area. And there's starting to be more interest in the idea of remotely controlling canines, dogs as well, in this way, not invasively, but more this exterior approach. So engineers are realizing dogs can travel over a variety of terrains way more effectively than even humans can, much less robots. And they're already naturally equipped with an arsenal of engineering sensors that give them superior ability to be able to detect and locate things that robots, we can't do it. We can't use robots to do this yet. We don't have this ability. And because dogs have these abilities, many goals that are a problem for robots and for man-made vehicles aren't a problem for canines. So they're excellent at guarding territories. They're excellent at carrying out search and rescue missions and guiding the visually impaired. They have an amazing sense of smell, and so they're being used to be able to detect explosives, narcotics, tobacco, even pipeline leaks, retail contraband, and even cell phones. Bed bugs, they're using dogs to detect bed bugs. And since engineers haven't yet developed a good robotic solution to be able to mimic this amazing ability of a canine, and we may never be able to, the U.S. Office of Naval Research funded a project to develop a solution. The Canine Detection and Research Institute at Auburn trained dogs to be able to detect explosives, and then they trained the dogs to be able to respond to tones and vibrations that were sent by remote control to a vest on the dog from the dog's handler or master some distance away. And so controlling the dog not by implanting anything into the dog's head, but instead controlling the dog by sending signals, vibrations and tones that he could feel or hear from outside of his body. Well, remote control isn't quite enough because the handler has to be able to see the dog wherever it's at and not be too far away from the dog for remote control to work well. And so you could think of many situations where the dog would be out of sight from the handler. Maybe he's moved off behind a distant building, at which time remote control capability becomes useless. And so the next natural step was to automate the remote control ability and take the handler out of the equation. And so just let a computer guide this dog, and thus making the dog a bio-robot or an animal cyborg. And so a system was developed to guide a dog to distant endpoints that we actually pre-programmed into a computer there at Auburn to control these dogs. This is a video of a field trial with the Auburn canine equipped with the control system that I developed using GPS, inertial sensors, and a microcomputer all in the vest of this dog that he's wearing. Tones and vibrations are emitted from the vest. The computer system guides the canine to its final waypoint where he retrieves, in this case, a bumper. He's then given a recall command by the system, prompting that canine to head back to the handler. So if cyborg development doesn't prove the presence of design on the earth, I don't know what does. I mean, it can't get more of an endorsement of the idea of design than that. So people designed by the designer, design based on the designer's designs, while at the same time claiming that those designs are not designed. Say that a few times. So engineers are forced to borrow from God's portfolio. So typically in this day and age, they're plagiarizing him because they're copying his work but not giving him due credit. You ever thought about that? It's frustrating to me as an engineer whenever I was studying this stuff and seeing the brazen arrogance of the engineers around me that are just flagrantly plagiarizing God, don't even design pirating. So cyborg development is like stealing God's design and then just using them as their own. The ethical approach, of course, as a designer would be to get copyright permission by using God for God's designs, by accepting his authorship of those designs, and then studying the terms of use that he has given to us for how to use these creatures and how to use the things that he has created for us, staying within the bounds of his permissions that he has granted. Engineers aren't really paying attention to that a lot of times, and they can overstep their bounds and go beyond what Scripture would be interested in them developing. And then, after studying and submitting to those terms that are listed in Scripture, give, of course, God due credit. Give unto God, give unto the Lord the glory that is due his name, Psalm 29 and verse 2. So engineers unable to match the designs of God are forced to mimic them. What a testament to the greatness of the chief engineer's designs. We may be able to try to fix some of the damage that has been done to the earth and to humans due to the entrance of sin and due to entropy that has been tormenting the earth since the beginning. But in the words of John Hildebrand, who I quoted earlier, we certainly can't improve on what we see in God's design. The truth is, clear evidence of design and planning and intent is all around us. And as the teleological argument says, where there's design, there must be a designer. God didn't leave himself without witness. Acts 14:17, his invisible attributes are clearly seen when you examine the things he made. So much so that Paul said it is without excuse for you to not come to a conclusion that there's a God. You're not going to be able to stand on Judgment Day and say, God, it wasn't my fault. You didn't give me enough proof. You're not going to be able to do that. It's without excuse. You can look at the things he made and follow it out, reason through to the logical conclusion, and you have to come to the realization there's got to be a super engineer behind this universe that created all of it, designed everything meticulously with purposes. It's all around us. It's even in us. And we'll talk about that more tomorrow. As we end this session, let me tell you about a few of the products that I have back there in the back. And as I said last night, Kyle and Eric have been here and I'm sure have brought a lot of our material, so I didn't bring everything, but I did bring a few items I wanted to highlight to you that are kind of newer products. This came in, I think it was October. There are 3 main areas of Christian evidences, three fundamental pillars that make up Christian evidences: the existence of God, the inspiration of the Bible, and the deity of Christ. And so we wanted to have a book for each of those. And we've had one on the inspiration of the Bible and the deity of Christ for probably a decade. And we finally got around to getting this book done on the existence of God. And in order for us to have time to do it, we actually just co-wrote it. Eric, Kyle, Dad, and me all co-wrote this. And it's on the classical argument, so we spend some time on the teleological like we did tonight, but also a lot of the other classical arguments as well. A good book for you to have in your library, be aware of that. The book Why People Suffer came out in the last year or two. I've lost track. The point of this book, the main argument people use against the God of the Bible is, how can there be a God that is all-powerful and all-loving, and yet there still be terrible things that happen to innocent people, like innocent babies and so forth? So either God is not loving, he's not stopping it, so he must not actually be a loving God like the Bible says, or he is loving but isn't powerful enough to stop it. Right? That's the main argument people have tried to use against the God of the Bible for centuries. And of course it's been dealt with many times over. But the Bible has a lot to say about that subject. So this book was written in layman's terms to be able to help people realize, what is going on with suffering. What does the Bible have to say about this subject? So you can imagine this is an important book for you to have, to be able to hand to people, especially that are being plagued with suffering that is causing them to question the existence of God due to that issue. Mentioned last night by book Science versus Evolution, which is basically the material from last night in a much more extended extended form. The first half of the book goes through those laws of science. The second half of the book, which I didn't even get to touch on, is responding to all of the arguments that they say in response to the first half of the book. Wait a minute, what about quantum mechanics? Why can't you have a universe pop into existence because of quantum mechanics? So I've got an appendix on that. And so I respond to all of the arguments that they make to try to deal with our arguments about the laws of science. That's the second half of the book. Anyway, we just reprinted this, and I added a significant portion to it last year, including addressing the multiverse idea, which is another big argument. A lot of the leading cosmologists, believe it or not, are starting to accept the comic book idea of a multiverse and are trying to say, okay, so there is a supernatural realm, but it's not God, it's the multiverse. There's other universes out there. And so I've got a whole appendix dealing with that ludicrous, irrational idea. And most of this stuff, you can go to our website and get it in article form on our website as well. But if you want it in printed form, you've got these books that you can purchase. Again, I brought copies of each of these. Reasons to Believe is a very thin book that gives those three fundamental pillars of the Christian faith in a very abbreviated way, and then has a chapter on, okay, now what? Giving the plan of salvation and going ahead and bringing people then on to Christ after they look at those three fundamental pillars of Christianity. So we put this out last year, and within a month we had to reprint it because it just bought like hotcakes. People are buying it in boxes because it's great as an evangelism tool to hand out to people. A great thing for you to have for that purpose as well, to hand out a copy of this to visitors that come in. Because chances are, you've got naturalism, and most people that walk through the door, just off the streets and all, they've been infected with this naturalism stuff. You're going to have to deal with these fundamentals with folks. This also came in, I think it was in October, God and Government, that my dad wrote. And the point of this book is, if God was to design a civil government, what would it look like? If you just want to let God be the total ruler of your life, even with regard to government, and you try to turn to Scripture and find principles that are relevant to that subject, what would a civil government look like? Well, interestingly, you take God designed a civil government. You take the Old Testament law code and strip it of the specific religious things that they did, you're left with a skeleton of what God has to say about punishment, about taxation, about immigration. A lot of the hot button issues we're dealing with today, God already dealt with it. And interestingly, the founders of this country realized that too, and the more Dad has dug in on that subject, the more he's seen they already caught on to that, and we're using specifically the Old Testament as a blueprint for this country with regard to the civil government. So a very fascinating book to help you get clarity, and especially young people before they go off to college and get thoroughly indoctrinated with socialism and so forth, which is totally unbiblical, that concept. It's important that they understand, what does God have to say about this stuff? How does God define a poor person, and what are your responsibilities, and what are things you shouldn't be doing for a poor person? The Bible has something to say about that too. A lot of good material on that subject in that book. Another book that he put out recently, this is a little booklet that's basically 1 page to 2 pages for every book in the Bible, giving a basic summary of each one of these. What is this particular book about in the Bible? You know, what is Genesis about? Is there a key verse to this? What's a basic outline of the book? Kind of giving people a general overview of the Bible in a very brief way. So if you were to sit down and read the Bible, this is an important thing you'd want to have. You could read this little summary page before you dig into that book, and it'll help give you context. So again, this is the kind of book you'd especially give to a new convert in helping them to know how to study the Bible. We got some stuff for teens as well. Even though this was written by Kyle with teens in his mind, I would put this in probably my top 5 favorite books at AP. I love this book because it gets straight to the point in dealing with the big arguments people use against the God of the Bible. It gets straight to it in a logical, rational way, but it doesn't have all of the references and so forth that are in his more in-depth, extensive book that we also have on that subject as well, which you need to have in your library. But this is more just getting straight to the heart of the matter for teens to be able to deal with this subject when their friends bring it up. You know, when people say, hey, the God of the Bible, he is sexist because he keeps the women down and they have to be submissive to the men, and he's racist because he gives preference to the Israelites, and he is genocidal because the Israelites come in and they wipe out entire civilizations, including women and children. You know, and he was pro-slavery, you know, because you see slavery in the Bible and God's not condemning, you know. So these are the standard arguments people have been making against God for millennia, really, and yet dealt with for teens in a very succinct way, helps them get their mind around how to respond to these things. These arguments are being made today by the naturalists, big time. And our young people are on the front lines having to deal with it. It's not all of us older heads that have, you know, most of the time we've kind of got our group of friends and we don't have to deal with a lot of that. Our young people are dealing with it. That's why they're leaving the church. It's over this stuff. We got to make sure they're equipped with the truth on this and not stick our heads in the sand and act like nothing's going on. That would be a sad thing for us to do. One of the things that whenever I was doing youth work in Texas that I kept seeing over and over and over and over and over is young people leaving the church due to how they're dating, how they're getting involved romantically with the opposite sex, how they're doing that, who they're dating, when they're doing it, why they're doing it. And so my wife and I wrote a book addressing that subject, trying to be more logical and prudent, careful in how we view that subject, because I think that is a great tool Satan is using to cause people to become faithless, or at least if they stay faithful, they usually don't make it through the dating years without scars that they regret because of how we're treating this subject, even in the church. A few other things. One of the big arguments people are trying to make today is, hey, we don't have the original handwritten copies of any of the books of the Bible. You don't have anything that Paul actually wrote. You have copies of copies at best, and usually copies of copies of copies of copies. How do you know that the Bible has been transmitted faithfully and then translated faithfully? And so you got a lot of people saying, oh yeah, even if the Bible was originally inspired, it's not now. It's been corrupted by the Catholic Church and twisted, and you don't have the Bible. It's loaded with thousands of errors. You think that's an important thing we need to be able to respond to? I mean, why are we here if that's the case, if that's true? This is a big deal. This is fundamental. We got to be ready to deal with this. Kyle debated Bart Ehrman, who is one of the leading minds in trying to promote that idea in our country, that the Bible, it cannot be trusted. It's loaded with errors. It was not transmitted faithfully. So this is a series my dad has, actually a seminar on that subject, showing looking into the actual evidence. You can trust the Bible. It's been transmitted and translated faithfully. This is a DVD he did recently on the idea of changes going on in the church with regard to worship, responding to things like, solos and choirs and hand raising and hand clapping, that sort of thing. This is the seminar that I do on science versus evolution. That is the stuff from last night, much more in depth, and then a lot of other things too, responding to specific evidences like the fossil record and the dating methods that they think prove an old Earth and so forth. This is a seminar I have on that subject. Is Genesis History is not a DVD that we develop. This is actually, but it's one that we recommend. This is actually put out by a guy that's denominational, but these are the leading young Earth creation scientists in the world, I would argue, that are did anybody see this movie when it came out of the theaters last year? Okay, not very many of you. This actually came out in the theaters for a couple nights last year nationwide, and it was a great opportunity to give the young Earth creation model to the world and show them that this is not a bunch of kooks that don't have evidence for young Earth creation. They gave the case for young Earth creation. These are scientists in the field. We're talking guys that go out and have gathered evidence for how you can know the Grand Canyon was formed rapidly. In fact, I'll talk about that in our next session. So these are guys I've actually been going into the field with, doing creation field work myself. This is a movie, Is Genesis History, that goes through into a lot of that evidence. Highly recommend that you have that and even show it here. Would be a great idea for you to do that. There was some, this is the final thing I'm going to show you before we take a little break here. There were certain verses that I wanted young people, whenever I was doing youth work, and my own kids to have memorized, specifically for evangelism purposes. Whenever I was doing youth work, I kept finding out that the young people would come up and ask the same questions. And then another one would come up and get old enough, and he'd go off to school and so forth, and his friends were asking the same questions. They'd come and ask me, and I kept having to do the same thing over and over and over. I started finding out there were certain verses that our young people need to have memorized because they answer the questions that are being asked by young people today. So I made a list of about 250 passages that kept coming up. I felt like if they have these passages memorized, they're going to be ready to answer questions that their friends are asking and do it with Scripture instead of just, paraphrasing and shooting off the cuff, instead of helping to instill faith in their friends' hearts by actually quoting Scripture. And so I thought, then I wanted my kids and our kids at Panama Street, where I attend, to be able to memorize this stuff. So I started developing memory work CDs, where I actually have tunes to help the kids memorize all kinds of things, not just verses, but other things too. So these are set to melodies and rhythms that make it much easier for kids to memorize, and adults to memorize these things. And I brought some copies of those as well. All right, we're going to take a brief break of, do we want to do a full 10 minutes? Or how about 5 minutes? Let's do 5-minute break, and then we'll start back again. Thank you for your attention.